4th of September, 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Philemon, verses 1 to 21, and Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. We tend not to think of the Apostle Paul as being very personally involved with those whom he taught, or of having much of a sense of humour. But both of those qualities are demonstrated in his letter to Philemon. He was writing for a very particular purpose, to make a request that Philemon had every right to refuse. The letter is addressed not only to Philemon, but also to Apphia, to Archippus, and to the local house church, perhaps to ensure that there would be witnesses to what Paul had to say. Paul was writing from prison, most likely in Rome, and he begins by commending Philemon for his faith, his love for the saints, and the joy and encouragement that news of Philemon's work in the church has given to Paul. I think Paul was buttering him up a bit, ready for what he wanted to ask. He clearly had great affection for Philemon. He calls him his dear friend and fellow worker, and he prays for Philemon's spiritual advancement. Then, with Philemon suspecting nothing, Paul begins to reveal his purpose, reminding Philemon that he could order him, but is actually appealing on the basis of love. With one final turn of the screw, he refers to himself as an old man and a prisoner, and Paul makes it almost impossible for Philemon to refuse. And that's when he makes his request. Although we call this the letter to Philemon, the central character is a slave called Onesimus. His name means useful, but that is unlikely to be the name his mother had given him. Rather, a slave dealer may have so named him, hoping to get a good price as a result. The letter is a plea to Philemon to receive back this runaway slave and to accept him now as a Christian brother. This is the entire purpose of the letter. Onesimus had been Philemon's slave, and he had run away. It seems that Onesimus had never been a hard worker. With a bit of humour and a play on the slave's name, Paul says, "Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and to me." There are hints in the letter that Onesimus was probably a thief. Under Roman law, he could certainly have been put to death. However, Paul had come across him, brought about his conversion, and Onesimus had become as a son to him, comforting him during his imprisonment. So useful had he become that Paul describes him as his very heart, and would have liked to keep him in order to help him during his imprisonment. But he sees the proper procedure is to send him back to his master, not now as a slave, but as a dear brother in Christ. Of course, this account begs the question, two questions actually. Did Onesimus have to return to his slave status, or was he set free? And what on earth was a good Christian man like Philemon doing with a slave? It seems highly unlikely that Philemon would return Onesimus to slavery. Paul's plea is comprehensive, acknowledging Philemon's right to keep slaves, but expecting him to free Onesimus as a spontaneous act of charity, and to receive him back as a fellow Christian. Paul promises to reimburse Philemon for any losses incurred. This is the hint that there may have been theft involved. And there's yet another turn of the screw, that Philemon owes Paul his very self, no doubt referring to his conversion to the faith. The issue of slavery is a more difficult one. We're shocked that slavery was allowed under the law. Slaves could even be seriously ill-treated with no repercussions unless the slave died. We're even more shocked that first-century Christians accepted and condoned slavery, and actually some of them owned slaves. In the 19th century, when moves were made to end the slave trade and later slavery itself, some prominent Christians opposed the move, claiming that slavery was biblical and to seek to end it was wrong. That now sounds appalling to us, although there are still some extreme evangelical Christians, Ronald McCune for one, who still hold to that view. All we can say is that in Bible times slavery was common in most parts of the world, and it was how societies operated. Slavery provided a workforce in exchange for food and shelter, not too dissimilar to the situation many find themselves in today, though we refer to it as 0 hours contracts rather than slavery. Also, the means to end the system, namely Parliament and democratic government, didn't exist then. It was not until William Wilberforce presented a bill to our Parliament and argued eloquently that an end to the slave trade was achieved. Christians in the 1st century worked within the system since they had no choice, except to act on a personal level, as Philemon may well have done if he set Onesimus free. We can gather that Paul is confident that Onesimus will be in safe hands, certain that Philemon will obey him to the letter, and even further. This letter is a masterclass in how Christians should be in their dealings with one another. Persuasive, gentle, humorous, merciful, confident, trusting, compassionate, self-sacrificing and forgiving. We should truly know one another and understand each other's needs and frailties. We can also take note that God makes demands of us, just as Paul did of Philemon. The cost of discipleship can be high. In our gospel passage, Jesus warned his potential followers that they must not love father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, or even their own lives more than him. Furthermore, they must be prepared to carry their cross in order to follow him. A cross in 1st century Palestine was not the nice religious symbol that it is today. It was an instrument of prolonged torture and execution, and anyone carrying a cross was heading for pain, humiliation and death. Jesus tells his listeners to first count the cost of following him before embarking on discipleship. But whatever the calculated cost, the price of discipleship is to be prepared to give up everything. Philemon was asked to make changes to his household to free a slave, to accept him as a brother in Christ. We shall all be asked to make sacrifices, some much greater than that which Philemon needed to make. But the reward ahead of us is great. May we all be prepared to move forward in our faith and service, following Christ's directions in all things.